Well, ladies and gentlemen, I really hope you've enjoyed your lunch. It's time now for the main event. Ladies and gentlemen, members and guests, our keynote guest speaker today is Meg O'Neill, Chief Executive Officer and Managing Director of Woodside Energy. It's a huge name in our space, and we're exceptionally pleased that Woodside and Meg could do this today. Our format is going to include a short address from Meg at the lectern, followed by a conversation on stage with leading journalist Chris Uhlmann. Chris is a Walkley Award-winning journalist and one of Australia's best-known political broadcasters. He's been the political editor at both Nine and ABC News and recently produced a documentary for Sky News called The Real Cost of Net Zero. He's going to join Meg on stage after her presentation, and for now, I'd like to invite my Kuroda partner, White & Case, to introduce our guest speaker, Meg O'Neill. Please will you welcome Mai to the stage.
Meg O'Neill grew up in Boulder, Colorado with two brothers. Her father was an electrical engineer come entrepreneur, and her mother a communications professional. Meg considered studying history before following her father's engineering footsteps and attending the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, where she graduated with degrees in ocean engineering and chemical engineering. She then began a 23-year career with ExxonMobil after a recruiter persuaded her that her future lay in designing oil and gas platforms rather than ships or luxury yachts. She started with Exxon in Houston, but spent time in New Orleans, Indonesia, Norway, and Canada across a variety of jobs, including engineering, operations, and general management roles. In 2018, she made the move to Perth to join Woodside as Chief Operations Officer and was appointed as CEO and Managing Director in 2021. This year, Meg celebrates 30 years in the oil and gas industry. Meg has transformed Woodside into the largest energy company listed on the Australian Securities Exchange and has expanded its global footprint. She's a huge champion for diversity and inclusion and challenges her team to have courage in all that they do. When not traveling for work, Meg and her wife enjoy holidays in Australia and abroad. Meg is an avid sports fan and a huge supporter of the home teams in Perth: West Coast Fever, Perth Scorchers, and Fremantle Dockers. Members and guests, please welcome Meg O'Neill to the Melbourne Mining Club.
Well, thank you, Mai, for that kind introduction, and thanks to the Melbourne Mining Club for hosting today's luncheon. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of this land, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I would also like to acknowledge some distinguished guests who are with us today, the co-patrons of the Melbourne Mining Club, Hugh Morgan and Lee Clifford, former Woodside Chair Charles Good, and former Woodside CEO and Managing Director Charles Allen, two legends of Woodside, and I'm humbled to be here with them today. It really is an honor to be speaking in this magnificent building, and places like this get me thinking about the things that have happened inside these walls over the course of time. Great debates, royal visits, famous performances, and I'm told that the Beatles performed here once with 20,000 screaming teenagers outside. And while Chris Uhlmann has developed a bit of a rock star following, I'm not sure that today's show will get quite that same attention. I do think it's very fitting to have a conversation about Australia's energy future in a town hall. Now, social media is sometimes described as a virtual town hall, but often discussions there lack the courtesy and civility that we show each other when we meet in person. Historically, town halls have been places where people come to put ideas on the table. And in my mind, too much of the recent discussion about energy has focused on taking solutions off the table. I say it's time we focus on putting ideas back on the table, ideas that can make the most of Australia's natural advantages. And we need to ensure that our energy policy debate is based on science and facts and not wishful thinking. Why? Because Australia's energy security and ongoing national prosperity are what's at stake. Let's think about where we are today. Productivity growth, which we know is crucial for future prosperity, is weak and has been for some time. As a trading nation, being competitive in global markets has long been essential to Australia's economic success. But amid rising global protectionism and even greater competition for capital, Australia must sharpen its competitive edge even further. And moves by the new administration in the US to deregulate the economy and spur new energy investments make the challenge for countries like Australia even more acute. Now, I probably don't need to tell a room full of people who are close to the mining industry this, but historically, cheap and reliable gas has been one of Australia's industry's great competitive advantages. Affordable energy keeps operating costs down, which means companies have more capital to invest in things that increase productivity. We must keep it this way, to safeguard the businesses we have now, and hopefully to attract the businesses of the future. Now let me give you an example. 5 years ago, few of us would have predicted the rise in artificial intelligence programs like ChatGPT, or that companies involved in artificial intelligence would now be scrambling to secure energy to invest and to power those data centers, going to lengths as radical as restarting idle nuclear power plants. This new demand for power only creates further pressure on traditional manufacturing industries that are already concerned about energy security. No matter how our economy evolves, we will succeed or fail on the strength of our energy system. Now, just like today, Australian companies of the future will need reliable, affordable energy to be the best in the world at what they do. This, in turn, can ensure our children and grandchildren enjoy the same opportunities we have today, if not better. By this, I mean good jobs in secure and competitive industries that pay enough to buy a house and live comfortably. And in a country as lucky and resource-rich as Australia, it would be a major policy failure if we are not able to accomplish this. We don't have to travel very far from here to appreciate how energy contributes to Australia's prosperity. 70 years ago, Woodside got its start exploring for oil and gas right here in Victoria, near the town of our namesake. Discoveries in the 1960s and 70s, particularly in Victoria and Western Australia, produced the oil and gas that have supported Australian mining, manufacturing, and prosperity. In Victoria today, Woodside is a part owner in the Bass Strait project. Operated by ExxonMobil's local subsidiary Esso, the Bass Strait project was Australia's first major offshore oil and gas development, located off the southeast coast of Victoria. Woodside has about a half share in the Gippsland Basin joint venture and about a third in the Kipper Unit joint venture. And I'm proud to say that every molecule of natural gas that Woodside sells from Bass Strait is consumed by local manufacturers, local power generators, and homes right here in Eastern Australia. And in Western Australia, about 50% of the domestic gas supplied by Woodside is used by mining customers to produce and process Australia's resources. Investment in new gas supplies can underpin the next wave of growth for an industry that is so important for Australia's ongoing prosperity. By supporting the emergence of a critical minerals processing sector and the decarbonization of steelmaking. Woodside is already collaborating with others on this challenge, with plans to supply energy to a pilot project aimed at using iron ore to make lower carbon steel. Initially, natural gas would be the energy source, but once operational, the project aims to use lower carbon emissions hydrogen. We announced our participation in this project in December alongside other consortium participants, BlueScope Steel, and two companies who are represented here today, Rio and BHP. We welcome the support for this project that we've received from federal and state governments. It demonstrates an appreciation about the role gas can play in delivering the innovative and tangible outcomes Australia needs to thrive through the energy transition. Now, of course, one of the key differences our society faces compared to previous generations is that we need to grow our economy while also responding to climate change. But there is no single solution to this complex challenge, and we must keep all ideas on the table. We cannot be ruling out any source of energy or any technology that can help in this journey. Again, we must be guided by science and facts. Now, on this front, I'm encouraged by the green shoots, no pun intended, in Australia's national energy conversation, including signs of an increasingly fact-based discussion around the role of gas. The fact is, gas is an ideal source of always available power, which can support Australia's expanding renewables grid. To quote the Australian energy market operator, gas is the ultimate backstop to ensure grid reliability. And when used to generate electricity, gas typically produces about half the life cycle emissions of coal. Now, this is even more critical when we think of the challenge of decarbonizing Asia. It's estimated that if just 20% of Asia's coal-fired power stations switched to gas, it would reduce carbon emissions by 680 million tons a year. And to calibrate that, that's more than 1.5 times Australia's total annual net greenhouse gas emissions, which in calendar year 23 was 433 million tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. I support all of us taking action to tackle climate change and do what we can to reduce emissions. But we need to prioritize measures that deliver the biggest bang for the buck when it comes to decarbonization. The reality is we get far more impact from replacing coal in Asia with Australian LNG than we do from asking Australian consumers to switch their household appliances from gas to electricity. Now, something else to consider is the economic opportunity that global decarbonization presents. So switching 20% of Asia's coal-fired power stations to gas would require 310 billion cubic meters of gas per annum. And to calibrate that number, in 23, Australia exported roughly 107 billion cubic meters of LNG. So about a third of the opportunity presented by China and Asia just eliminating 20% of coal. Now, the Western Australian government has demonstrated it understands the opportunities that switching from coal to gas presents. It's provided clear support for Western Australia's own transition plan, and as one of the contributions that the state can make to the global challenge of climate change. And I'm cautiously encouraged at the growing recognition of the importance of natural gas here in Victoria. But to achieve decarbonization and economic growth, which ultimately secures our future prosperity, we need further action at all levels of government. We need action to reduce red and green tape that slows down development of new job-creating projects that would create those new, desperately needed energy supplies. And we need action to challenge activist organizations practicing lawfare, which prioritizes the political agendas of a few over the national interest. Like many of the companies represented here today, Woodside is proudly Australian, but we also operate in other countries. And it's a fact that we can get projects assessed and approved overseas in less time than it takes here in Australia. Take our Northwest Shelf project extension proposal. Since 1984, the Northwest Shelf project has powered homes and industry in Western Australia. It's paid more than $40 billion in royalties and excise, and it has provided tens of thousands of secure, well-paying jobs, both direct and indirect. Extending the life of this existing infrastructure would enable these benefits to continue for decades to come. And in December, we received approval from the WA state government to do this, to extend the life of the plant. But it came after 6 years of assessment and appeals within WA's environmental approval system, despite bipartisan support for the proposal. And now, we are eagerly awaiting a federal decision, as a second environmental regulator has to consider the same matter. And of course, our workforce and their families in Karratha are also holding their breath on this topic. Now, look, we understand the need for robust environmental assessment, but when an approval to continue to use existing infrastructure takes more than 6 years, it's in nobody's interest. It does not give Australia a competitive advantage or better environmental outcomes. We need action to reverse this trend and make sure Australia is a place that proudly homegrown Australian companies like Woodside can continue to invest in for the long term. And we need action to bring on new gas supplies so that Australia does not risk rising power bills, energy shortfalls, and an uncertain energy transition. Ensuring Australia continues to thrive as an excellent place to live, work, and invest as we decarbonize is a shared challenge. I've outlined my ask of government. It goes without saying that we in industry must step up as well. We must sharpen our focus on technology and innovation to ensure that Australia's resources sector remains cost competitive and a world leader. We must maintain our social and economic contributions to ensure we keep the trust and confidence of the Australian community. And we must continue to decarbonize our businesses in line with national and international goals. And finally, as we navigate this shared challenge, we must have the courage to keep all options on the table and be guided by the facts as we map a prosperous future together. Thank you.
Well, Meg, thank you so much for that. And I was thinking as you began that if these walls could talk, they would tell you, as many of the buildings that were built in Melbourne at about the same time, was that this is a product of the gold rush, that marvellous Melbourne was built by mining. And isn't it a marvel that progress means that this is now the most hostile state in Australia to mining? But I'll leave that as a statement and move on to some questions. Speaking of Victoria, since we're here and you run the gas that powers Victoria, how critical is supplies getting?
Look, it's probably worth framing this in the context of history. So when we started producing oil offshore Victoria, gas was a byproduct. And the choice was either you burn it or you sell it cheap to local industry. And the decision was taken, rightfully, sensibly, to sell it cheap. And that underpinned manufacturing growth in Victoria. Cheap energy. I can't stress enough the importance of cheap energy and its connection to economic prosperity. Now, as time wore on, and again, Bass Strait started producing in the 60s and 70s, we transitioned from being an oil-dominated asset to gas-dominated, where we're having to invest capital just for gas. And the venture's been happy to pursue those opportunities, but again, it means the gas isn't quite as cheap as it used to be. That field is now mature, it's on decline. Year on year, we're going to lose capacity. And so our ability to come to the rescue on those cold days in winter or the hot days when people need the AC is becoming reduced year in, year out. So look, I'm very worried about Victoria. The Australian Energy Market Operator has signaled that there'll be structural deficits as soon as 2027, and there could be short-term deficits as early as this year. So I think we all need to be quite concerned.
Yeah, and I think the point that we need to make at the outset is the Australian Energy Market Operator's plan, the government's plan for 82% renewables, says it needs 15 gigawatts of gas, not just now, but all the way through until 2050. So this is an inherent part of the plan. It's not, in fact, the backup, it's the backbone, because that system won't work without gas.
Absolutely. And Western Australia has been very transparent about this. I don't know that that fact has been spotlighted as clearly in the East Coast. When you transition away from coal and towards renewables, you double the amount of gas you need in the power sector just to keep the lights on.
So do you think that the Victorian government has got the message yet? Are they welcoming you to look for gas in Victoria?
So I said in my speech that I was cautiously optimistic. In their economic plan, buried deep in it, there was a line about supporting natural gas. The challenge we have in Victoria is we've had 10 years of the government saying you're not allowed to explore and please go elsewhere. So is there gas here? Yes, I'm sure there is. Will Woodside come rushing back to explore? We're going to be pretty thoughtful about that. You know, there's other places we can invest our money.
And ironically too, of course, when there was a gas shortage, the Victorian government, Dan Andrews said that he demanded the coal seam gas from Queensland, while saying that you're not allowed to look for it in Victoria.
Yes, that's quite ironic.
It's a bit of a head scratcher, isn't it?
It is.
And now we're at the stage where we might be importing gas into Victoria and New South Wales. What do you make of that?
Well, look, as an LNG seller, I think it's a good opportunity for us.
But it will be done at the international price.
Look, we'll sell it at an appropriate market price. It is really puzzling, though, that the state that was built on the back of oil and gas is now at a stage where, due to political reasons, and again, that's why I was making the point around we need to focus on science and technology and the facts, ideology has stood in the way of sensible energy investment here in Victoria.
So when you're looking around the world, because you've got a global footprint, how difficult is it to do business in Australia?
I shared the example of our Northwest Shelf life extension approvals, and again, it's just mind-boggling. We have a plant, we're not changing the fence line, we're not changing the stuff that's inside the plant. In fact, if anything, we're going to be improving the emissions performance because we have corporate commitments to reduce emissions. So we're not changing our footprint. 6 years to give us a life extension. It's baffling. If I contrast it, and you know, the US is a great example. The ability to do business in the US is just next level compared to the bureaucracy we confront here.
And what about lawfare? Because you don't just have to deal with the governments, you have to deal with the courts and the interpretation that's put on the law, and very cashed up groups that are now taking you to court.
It's fascinating. So the US, of course, is litigious, but the per capita most litigious nation in the world on environmental matters is Australia, which is quite stunning. Again, for a nation whose prosperity has been built on the back of resources and affordable energy, this litigation is impeding progress, it is slowing down developments, and importantly, it's a deterrent. So as investors look at where might I put future capital, they're going to say, well, Australia, slow approvals, I'm likely to get challenged in court versus other places where I can get business done. Australia is not competing. And
of course, there is competition. The US government's saying drill, baby, drill, and there might be a change of government in Canada, and there's heaps of oil and gas there.
There is, and the thing that's really striking about drill, baby, drill, two things. One, very clear support for the oil and gas industry. The interesting fact about the US is oil and gas production grew under Biden. So despite the rhetoric, the reality is the capital markets and the opportunities in the US enable activity and enable investment and enable production of our core energy resources. But drill, baby, drill really is an affirmation of the importance of oil and gas and the essential nature of oil and gas in providing energy to unlock other economic growth.
And you make that really important point too of looking at what governments do as opposed to what they often say. How important is the word energy security around the world at the moment, particularly after we saw what happened in Europe with the invasion of Ukraine?
It's huge, and I speak to company leaders, I speak to governments in nations all around the world. Australia, we're blessed with abundant natural resources, as is the US. But you go to many of our important trading partners, places like Japan and Korea, who don't have these blessings. And they're worried about, you know, how do they keep their energy affordable? How do they keep their economies growing? How do they keep prosperity alive for their people?
Australia was once seen as a reliable marketplace for those countries. It's important for us on national security level. Do they still see us as a reliable customer?
Look, it's wobbling. And you can look at, there's been a variety of interventions in the gas industry particularly. There's a mechanism, the ADGSM, Australia Domestic Gas Security Mechanism, that's, you know, potentially has the ability to impede exports. There's been additional taxes that are imposed specifically on the gas industry and only on the gas industry. There's just been a number of price caps here in the East Coast market. Even things like the coal royalty in Queensland. Again, government overnight changing the rules, changing the fiscal terms. Those are the sorts of things that investors get worried about. And we look around the world and we ask ourselves, where do we have the confidence to invest our capital knowing that the terms are unlikely to change for 20 years?
I was speaking to a former Treasury official the other day and was told that when the government was putting forward its price cap mechanism, the advice was to go from Treasury that this would reduce supply, and that advice was taken out. What happened when the price cap mechanism went in?
Yeah, it reduced supply. I mean, it's not rocket science, right? This is economics 101. Go ask your high schooler who's studying economics. As soon as someone says there's a price cap on the product you can sell, what are you going to do if you're an entrepreneur? You're going to change the product, or you're going to go elsewhere.
I was in the United States last year, and people talk about California as being the poster child, really, for when it comes to wind and solar generation, and it is, and it has the highest electricity price in continental USA. In fact, Texas has more wind and solar than California, but it has very cheap gas. Do you think that they're sending us a message?
I think the Texas-Victoria comparison is a fascinating one. Texas, out of their electricity generation, 24% is gas. Victoria is 21%. Scale of the grid is much higher as well. But as a proof point, you'd say ideologically, those are the two states that are as far apart as you can be. But it's a proof point around the impact that you can have through efficient regulation. In Texas, you can do business, and the Texas government is open for business. And if you want to drill oil and gas wells, awesome. If you want to build wind farms, awesome. They are there to facilitate investment, and the reality is they've got a lot of renewables in the grid as an outcome.
And speaking in the US last year to the guy whose only job in the United States is to make sure that the lights stay on, so it's reliability. His name's Jim Robb, runs the entire North American grid, all of the grids, and they're interconnected into Canada, into Mexico. He said they're now getting requests from artificial intelligence for 1 gigawatts worth of electricity. He said, to put that in perspective, that is the load for San Francisco in a single undiversified load. So that means that 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 1 gigawatts worth of electricity. You can't do that on wind and solar, and it would appear that in places like Texas, now these centres will set up alongside gas fields. Do you think that's an opportunity for a country like Australia?
It is, and it's fascinating. And a bit of the comments I made around data centers were, data centers are power hogs, but they're accelerants for other economic prosperity. So we should be saying, look, this is a business that we want to have here in Australia. We've got to crack the power challenge. And how do you crack it? You've got to get new supply into the mix, and it's not going to be wind and solar. It's got to be something that's firm, so that's natural gas. It's potentially nuclear.
You talked about being technology neutral too. Could you expand a bit on that for us? What kind of technologies do we need to have in the mix in Australia?
Yeah, all of the above.
Which is what Obama said, by the way, when he was asked about what do you want, nuclear, gas, wind, solar, and his response was that.
Yeah, it needs to be all of the above. And each of those sources brings a little bit something different. Solar and wind in the right jurisdictions can be a bit complementary, but they'll never give you 24/7 power. They'll never give you the power you need to run a factory. You've got to have something that firms. Gas, you have the ability to turn on and off and turn up and down quite flexibly, so gas offers a lot of compatibility. But if you ask, well, what's going to give you reliable baseload power that's low carbon? It's nuclear. So you've really got to have everything in the mix. I mean, this is a complex problem that we're trying to solve.
And if you don't have nuclear energy in the mix, could you ever get to net zero?
I think that'll be a stretch, honestly. I think it gets very expensive. Maybe that's the better way to say it. Can you affordably get to net zero without nuclear? I think you will realize that the last probably 15 to 20% gets very, very expensive.
The other thing too is, do you think that people understand in a general conversation about what energy actually is and where it actually exists and where fossil fuel is used? Now, you're a chemical engineer. Can you go around this room for us and tell us where we might find oil and gas in places we never expected?
Well, start with your clothing. Odds are good your clothings have some synthetic fabrics, unless they're fancy wool suits. Your mobile phone, the screens here, all of the cabling. The building's old, so the building might be actually wood. The car that you're driving, the the medical technologies that are used to ensure that people can get medicines, that doctors can operate in a sterile environment. The list goes on. Furniture. Most furniture these days would have synthetics that are made from petrochemicals or oil.
Do you think we should go outside and tell the people from Extinction Rebellion where their glue comes from?
Where their glue comes from, where the marker that they use to write on the board comes from. The board itself probably has a bit of synthetic in it. Yes. Even the bicycle they rode here on.
Indeed, and the roads that they ride on.
Yes.
So when we're talking about net zero, and quite often this conversation now has been locked for a very long time on how we decarbonise the electricity sector, that is 18% of the problem. How do we deal with the primary energy system that does all of the things that you do? The entire modern world has been built, and I think you told me 100 million barrels of oil a day has been built on oil, gas and coal. How do we rapidly move away from that without imposing costs that will be unbearable on the community?
That's the challenge. And maybe just to give a bit of scale, so every single day the world uses more than 100 million barrels of oil, and it's for a variety of products. Obviously it's fuel in your car, jet fuel, asphalt for roads, all of the products that we talked about. We also use coal, and coal usage continues to grow. I mean, despite 10 years since the Paris Agreement of pursuing net zero and decarbonization, coal use has grown every year bar 2020, where all energy products slipped.
And again, our energy minister likes to constantly talk about China and the amount of renewable energy it uses, and it is enormous, of course. Like everything in China, it's bigger than everything else. But it now burns 57% of the world's coal. 60% of its electricity actually is coal-fired power. Only 13% comes from wind and solar. So the shop front is very different to the factory floor.
Absolutely. And China is a great example of walking the talk of all of the above. They have coal. They are trying to grow a domestic gas industry. They've not been blessed with some of the resources we have here, so they do import quite a bit of gas. They've got the potential for renewables with solar and wind. So it's all of the above because their primary goal is energy security and keeping energy prices down to underpin economic growth. The math is very simple. It's A to B to C.
Yeah, but when we look at what's happening in the world and what's actually going on with these governments is that India isn't doing net zero, China is not doing net zero, Russia is not doing net zero, the United States has now pulled out of the Paris Agreement as not doing net zero. That is 60% of the world's emissions. So what should Australia be doing? And will anything we do have any effect at all on the climate?
The answer to the second question is not materially. The thing Australia can do that will have the biggest impact is export more LNG. So Australian LNG, displacing coal use in Asia, can help tackle the problem. Domestically, again, the emissions out of Australia are not a significant contributor. Now, I appreciate that tackling climate change is something where we all need to be rowing together and we all need to be playing our parts, governments, companies, and individuals. But at the end of the day, if you ask what's the most economically efficient way for Australia to contribute, it's LNG into Asia.
And if you were serious about it, and if you looked at what happened around the rest of the world, is that the material changes in the United States to its carbon footprint came when it was shutting down coal and replacing it with gas.
Absolutely, and that was just the market at work. That wasn't an edict, because again, that's happened over time from Obama to Trump to Biden to Trump again. It'll continue to happen. The ongoing development of natural gas is keeping natural gas prices down. It's the market working. It's not ideology.
Now, when we go back to when we were talking about the transition a few years ago, the Energy Security Board actually said that we need a capacity mechanism, which is that we need to know that we have capacity in the system. If we call on it, that it's there. It can't be done with wind and it can't be done with solar. The recommendation to government was that gas be included in the capacity mechanism. In fact, that the existing assets of coal be included in that mechanism and a value be put on delivering electricity. And yet, the energy ministers decided to exclude gas and coal. Should gas be included in the capacity investment scheme?
Absolutely. I mean, it's a bit of a head scratcher. You have a quote-unquote capacity mechanism to provide capacity when you have a crisis, but there's nothing there that you can call. So if it's 8 p.m. On a still night in Melbourne, can you pick up the phone and call your solar panel and say, please put power in the grid? No. You've got to have gas.
You know, I think we're unique in the world of having the only capacity mechanism that doesn't have any dispatchable capacity in it.
Yes.
Yeah. Anyway, when you're looking around the world again too, and this one is always contested, the technology is difficult, it makes things more expensive. Is carbon capture and storage a viable proposition? Can you make it work at a price that is affordable?
So let me answer that in a couple ways. First off, the technology works. So despite some of the rhetoric here, carbon capture and sequestration works. It's been used for decades, both in the US as well as offshore in Norway. So technology is viable. It's also used here. It's been used at Gorgon for, plus or minus six or so years. If the world is serious about decarbonizing, CCS has to be used at scale. We've got to figure out how can we start taking CO2 or taking emissions out of the atmosphere and sequestering them. It is not inexpensive. And that is the reality that everybody is confronting, is changing from the system we have today, which was built on large-scale, highly efficient supply chains to get oil and gas to where the customer needs it exactly when the customer needs it. We're displacing it with something that is less efficient, inherently less efficient, and it's more expensive. So CCS will be part of the mix. Things like hydrogen and ammonia will be part of the mix. But what everybody's been grappling with is the reality that those are more expensive than what we use today.
We look around this building for us today, we're talking about the gold rush, but of course the first parliament in Australia was here when we federated, and during the time of that parliament we had to harvest the decision. Australia decided at the beginning of the 20th century that we would be a high-wage economy, which is a good decision. But we're also a low energy cost economy. In the 21st century, can anything be made in Australia if we decide we're going to be both a high-wage economy and a high energy cost economy?
When we think about where to invest our dollars, we look around the world, and in oil and gas, we look at where's the resource potential. Even with some of our new energy aspirations, we look at where's the resource potential. So that's question one. Question two is, does the government want us there? Do we have support for our investment going in? And there's places where we're loved. And then you start looking at fiscals. So you look at what's the tax rates, what's the wage rates, what's the energy cost, what's the cost of doing business. Right now, if I had to stack up Australia versus the US, it loses on all four fronts. Corporate tax is higher, wages are higher, energy costs are higher, supply chain is more complex and more expensive. So we've got a few headwinds that we're having to fight through to make new investments here.
Can I ask you one slightly personal question? You are a person who deals with facts. This is not our first conversation. But in the way that gas has been demonised in the Australian political discourse, you, in fact, personally have come under threat. Your house has come under threat. Your family has come under threat. Has this been a punishing place to be? And is the way that politics is played in Australia at the moment actually making us a much poorer society, not just economically, but as a society?
We think it's important to have good debates, and complex matters like the future of the nation, future economic choices, where we'll get our future prosperity from. Look, we're going to have a robust debate, and we think that's absolutely appropriate, and I think that's absolutely appropriate. Crossing the line of going to people's houses, threatening their families, that sort of intimidation has no place in a civilized society.
Amen.
And those are the sorts of factors that also have a bit of an overhang on Australia.
All right, well, if this room does actually have ears and some of the history has been put into perspective today by you, thank you very much. And I think we're going to get some questions from the floor.
Ladies and gentlemen, a round of applause.
Thank you.
Thank you, Meg, and thank you, Chris. We've now got questions, time for questions from the floor. Put your hand up, and if you have a question, please will you state your name and affiliation prior to asking. Richard, first cab off the rank.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Chris. And Hedley. It's Owen Hegarty. I'm chairman of EMR Capital. We're a private equity group in the mining and resources sector here in Australia and worldwide. And I'd like to thank you, Meg, for a wonderful, wonderful address, and particularly the Q&A, being open, frank, and very clear about it all. So thank you for that, an absolute breath of fresh air, and a great diversity and a great mix of energy products over a period of time, and keep all options open. Very, very good and clear enunciation there. Thank you very much for that. My question doesn't relate to that at all. It actually comes back to, I was informed that you were working for Exxon going back into the US in the first Trump administration, and we're just a bit interested in perhaps some blinding insights from you as to how you think the second Trump administration will go, particularly with respect, obviously, to energy, but keeping that stable, environment that you mentioned there for not changing the rules for 20 years or thereabouts. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you for the question, Owen, and thank you for the kind remarks. Look, I think the Trump administration has been very clear about the role of oil and gas and their desire to see continued investment in oil and gas underpinning the U.S.'s economic growth and prosperity. The thing that perhaps stands out is the very immediate and real actions to tackle that. So lifting a pause on LNG project approvals, reopening offshore acreage for oil and gas leasing, reopening federal lands for oil and gas leasing. The reality in our sector, and you would appreciate this, we've got long-dated investments, so the investment cycle takes a bit of time to play out. So the effects of many of those policy decisions will take a bit of time. But the reality is it's a very clear signal of support for the industry. And a continued desire to focus as well on simplification of regulation, which I think is also, again, very enabling for ongoing investment, not just in oil and gas. And that's why I talk about Texas. I think Texas is a great example that when you have the right policy framework and you have the right environment, capital will go to opportunities where you can be profitable. So, the U.S. really isn't opposed to renewables. Again, you get the settings right, and people will invest in things that can make profit, and, again, good outcomes come from that.
I think we've got a second question down the back, and I forgot to mention before, there's a 42-second limit on asking the question.
I'll be very quick. I've been in the mining industry 40 years, and I worked for Bechtel. My interesting question to you is that we've had quite a lot of television cameras here today, and Channel 9 representative up there on the stage with you. It'll be most interesting tonight to see the 6 o'clock news, to see if any mention is made of the 6 years you had to put up with government bureaucracy to then get a no answer. I find it staggering as a shareholder of various companies and a retired person who's very proud of being in the mining industry. But 6 years to put up with that crap is terrible. And thank you very much for highlighting it to us. Thank you.
Meg, you're welcome to respond to that. I think there was a question mark at the end of the statement, but you treat it as you wish.
Well, it is staggering, and that's why I raise it. And, it's probably, I had a long list of environmental approvals that are difficult. I chose to spotlight that one for this session. But it's worth highlighting as well, we've been working on an opportunity to bring solar power into one of our LNG facilities for 6 years. Now, we've negotiated with the traditional custodians, we have an Indigenous land use agreement, we have the contractor lined up, but we've been negotiating with government about transmission. And again, if you contrast it to Texas, where you've got a state regulator, you can get transmission built in Texas, and here we've, been having quite a bit of hand-wringing around how do we get transmission built. It's not even that long a line. So the frustration we experience is not just in the oil and gas part of our business, it's across the business.
Just down here in the middle with...
Hi, Meg. Noel Newell, 3D Energy. Good to see you in Melbourne. Oil and gas people get very lonely over here, and we need people like you. Look, just on a positive note, this is the future of gas in Victoria. We have Ken here from Mitsui, producing gas in the Otway. Jesse from GB Energy, the new gas storage facility, and of course my company, Exploring with Conoco. My question relates to Labor's future gas strategy. What policy changes have you seen from these statements they've made in regard to the gas strategy in Australia?
Let me start by commending Minister Madeleine King and her team for working very collaboratively across government to get the future gas strategy out there. It's got some very clear messages that gas is part of Australia's energy mix to 2050 and beyond, and that Australian gas has a role to play in the region to 2050 and beyond. So a very important headline, very important to have that strong support from the Labor government. The challenge that we've encountered is we're not seeing the policy actions to enable us to make that strategy a reality. We continue to be frustrated with consultations associated with offshore approvals. There are gas development opportunities in New South Wales that are frustrated with native title procedures. The environmental approvals that I've talked about for Northwest Shelf. Browse, which is Australia's largest single undeveloped offshore asset and will be important to the future of Western Australia in the 2030s. We've also been working on those approvals for 6 years, and I have no ability to forecast when we'll get those. So that's the opportunity for government, is to start removing the barriers that impede us from delivering on that future gas strategy.
I think we've got one down the back, Meg, and if there's time, there's another one in the middle.
My name's Neil Smith. I'm a humble Woodside shareholder. So my question, and it was a little bit about the last question, but my question is in regards to Victoria specifically. What could we do as a state to make it easier for a company like Woodside to invest? And as part B, what are the dangers of not investing in gas to the Victorian economy?
Well, first and foremost is lift the moratorium. Again, it's really a head scratcher to think that the gas trends that exist in coal seams in Queensland don't somehow extend down here. So lift the moratorium. Stop with the anti-gas rhetoric. Embrace the need for gas. Again, I think many have been shy to publicly back gas for fear that they'll be criticized as, anti-climate change or anti-environment. But we need to have leaders who will step up and speak up. Roger Cook out west is a great example of a leader who speaks up and is very clear about the role for gas. So again, get the policy settings right, make it clear that this is a place that the government wants us, and that'll open the door. It'll still take time, though. And credit to Noel and the folks at 3D Energy and the people who are battling it out to get gas developments up here in Victoria. It's not easy, but it's incredibly important to the state. And as I said when I was talking about the history, the manufacturing industry here was built on the back of cheap energy. To Chris's point, we accepted high wages, but we always were blessed with cheap energy. The manufacturing capability of this state will be eroded if we do not continue to find cheap energy.
Final question. I think it's from the future of gas in Victoria, again in the middle here. Meg?
Yeah. My name is Rob Annals, the chairman of Red Sky Energy. I think here we are in Victoria, Meg. Thank you for a lovely presentation, but there's a couple of people, excuse me, that need to be mentioned, and one is the founding chairman of Woodside, the late Jeff Donaldson, and of course Charles Allen, who's here somewhere, I believe. Thank you, Charles. Two pivotal people in the development of this company, and without whom you wouldn't be here today. There's no reflection on you. Thank you very much to those two gentlemen, Jeff particularly. Thank you.
Yeah, look, maybe I can respond to that. I am humbled at the history of our company. We had tremendous leadership with Mr. Donaldson, who I was unfortunately not able to meet with him before he passed. But I'm really honored to have two other legends of Woodside in the room. Charles Allen, who was the CEO and managing director when we took the investment decision on Northwest Shelf, And again, for a tiny explorer to get the contracts lined up, get the funding, get the supports to progress what was Australia's most significant industrial development at the time was phenomenal. Charles, thank you for that leadership. And Charles Good, who was the chair of Woodside at the time we took an investment decision on Pluto. And that was a momentous decision for Woodside. So there's two real titans of our company in this room, and I'm just humbled to be with them today.
That's a wonderful note to bring the ends together. So I would like to call on Mark Flanagan from AMC Consultants to deliver the vote of thanks. Mark?
Thanks, Hedley. Good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to give the vote of thanks to Meg for participating in today's discussion. Meg provided us with great insight into how Woodside is complementing the resources sector with global energy transition efforts and the role we play in the success of these efforts and Australia's economy. Meg highlighted that critical to this ongoing success is the ability for all stakeholders to work together, ensuring that we can implement change in a timely manner to meet society's needs and expectations. Celebrating 70 years of history, starting in Australia and evolving into a global business, it's evident an exciting future lay ahead for Woodside to meet these challenges. I would also like to acknowledge Chris's excellent facilitation of the discussion, providing an interesting platform for all of us to hear about these important topics. Thanks, Chris. Meg, on behalf of the Melbourne Mining Club and everybody here, we wish you and Woodside every success. Please join me in extending a very warm thank you to Meg for her engaging conversation. Thank you.
All right. Okay.
Oh, thank you very much. Thank you. No worries. Take care. Thanks, mate.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. Oh, it's quite heavy.
It's a bit of an inside joke.
Okay. All right. That's awesome.
No worries, mate. No worries, mate.
It's good. Thank you.
Is that thing licensed in Victoria?
I'm not sure how I'm going to get it home.
I always think there's a delicious irony in presenting a mining engineer with a geological hammer, but it's even funny when it needs to go through security.